There is one statement, one verse, that speaks strongly to the subject of God's creation. We all know what that is. It's Genesis 1:1. And if I can remember my Hebrew, it's Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And the words mean, at least literally, beginning, create God, heavens and earth.
Yes.
Now that's the semantic meaning. Tell me what it really means.
All right. The expression hashemayim ve'et haaretz is an idiom in Hebrew for the whole universe.
The heavens and earth.
Exactly. It means the heavens and the earth. There is no word in Hebrew for the universe. So this is an idiom by which they would express the universe. So in effect, verse 1 says, in the beginning, God created the universe. And I think this speaks of the absolute creation of the universe by God that is investigated by modern cosmology. And then in the second verse, the focus dramatically narrows now, and it says, and the earth was without form and void. So the first verse speaks of God's creation of the cosmos, and then from verse 2 on, it's speaking of how God turns the earth from an uninhabitable wasteland into a habitable environment for man.
Now, you can read some modern translations which blur verse 1 and 2 together and make, I don't know, verse 1 something like an introduction to verse 2, like when God was doing all this stuff, and then the focus is on refashioning the earth itself. And so you lose, in that understanding, any sense of a creation.
You're correct that for some time, until at least recently, a number of biblical exegetes or scholars attempted to construe verse 1 as a subordinate clause. When God created the world in the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and so forth. But I think that this view has now been widely rejected and undermined on the basis of studies such as those by Klaus Westermann of the Hebrew of this passage. What he has been able to show is that when you have this grammatical construction in Hebrew, the material in the first passage, first clause, represents an independent, self-standing clause. And what follows in the second clause is something that is logically or temporally posterior to the first one. So that in fact this isn't a subordinate clause construction. It is a main clause followed by a conjunction. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then in Hebrew it says, and the earth was without form and void. So that these represent two independent clauses conjoined by a conjunction.
In Hebrew, that conjunction often has a lot of power in terms of differentiating things. So what you're saying is that first verse stands alone as a giant pillar, as you will, holding up this concept, this theory of God as creator. And then we deal with the specifics of how he did it.
Yes, how he made the earth into a habitable environment. I think that's exactly right, Robert. The first verse, in a sense, stands outside of the typical ancient Near Eastern creation narratives, which would first describe a kind of situation and then how God intervened in that situation to change it. And it stands outside of that as a kind of preface or prefatory statement that the author has added to say that this represents an absolute beginning of creation, and then it goes on to describe how God went on to
Your point is
an
interesting one, because many people would say that the creation myth, using myth in an anthropological sense,
Sure.
in Genesis is largely the same, if not derivative, of many other creation myths of the ancient Near East. Are you saying that verse 1 is qualitatively different than other creation myths?
Yes, I am. In these ancient Near Eastern creation myths, they typically have the form of saying, when such and such was the case, then God did blank. And you have this pattern in verse 2, that the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters, and then God said, "Let there be light," and so forth. What the author of Genesis does is prefix to this traditional mythical formula, verse 1, as an absolute and independent clause. In the beginning, God created the universe. And then comes your more typical formulaic mythical statement of how God took a situation and transformed it into something else.
You are saying that Genesis 1:1 is then utterly unique in Middle Eastern creation myths.
That's exactly right. In ancient Near Eastern creation stories, you typically have a formula that begins, when such and such was the case, then God did blank. And that's what you have, for example, beginning in verse 2 of Genesis. When the earth was without form and void, then God said, "Let there be light," and so forth. And what the author of Genesis did was to take this traditional ancient Near Eastern mythical formulation and prefix it with verse 1 as an absolute independent statement. In the beginning, God created the universe. And then describes the transformation of that. So it is a dramatic way of differentiating Israel's belief about God and the creation of the world from all of its ancient Near Eastern neighbors.